I came to Peebles first on Beltane Saturday, 1950, from Glasgow. The earlier part of my life, I was pretty streetwise in Glasgow, having used the underground tram cars, buses, and steam trains, because I travelled across the city to go to school in Glasgow Academy. But the offer was to continue in Glasgow Academy as a boarder, or to come to Peebles with my family and go to Peebles High School, and I certainly opted for the latter. And although I was only 11, I was admitted to the first year at Peebles High School, although all my classmates were a year older. When I first arrived in Beltane Saturday at 20 to 11 off the 8 o'clock bus direct from Glasgow, I stood on the pavement outside what was the National Commercial Bank, now Breeze, and was surprised that the parish church steps were half empty, because unbeknown to me, the crowning ceremony had taken place at 10 a.m. and I thought it was going to be 11 a.m. However, all these principals in the Beltane at that time became my classmates at the high school, and I think we were a good class. I had a great time at the high school. And these were formative years, but my eyes were soon opened to the delights of the countryside, because I had been very much a city boy, and I was taken by a chap called Ian Todd, cousin of Tom Fairbairn, to the hills, and introduced to hill walking, even in the early 50s, which was wonderful. I cycled to school from our house in 23 Kirkland Street every day, and going up Spring Hill I was often late, but I would overtake E.L. Smith, the history teacher, Butcher Smith, Lyndall's father, and he was even later than I was. I would skip assembly and then join the classes. The memorable teachers at the school at the time were Slugger Todd of physics, Tiger Smith for mathematics, and Francis Hamilton started us off in French and had us assembled in the school concert in first year's high school, singing Alouetta, Alouetta, and little French songs. The reason our family came to Peebles was that my father had been in cotton textiles in Bridgeton, but the industry was running down big time after the Second World War, and he had to find some other form of employment. He bought the business of Weatherstone and Son at 16 to 18 Dean Park, which is on the corner and is now Cranston House, where he was a middleman tweed merchant dealing in woolen fabric, whereas he had really spent his years in cotton fabric. The business was a sort of mini version of Warwick Woolens, formerly Lord Donald and now Holland and Sherry, yes. And he was a middleman, wholesale tweed merchant, buying bolts of cloth from the manufacturers and selling suit lengths and smaller amounts to local tailors, because in these days, in the early 50s, or in the late 40s, early 50s, your suit was being made to measure, because that was how you dressed. And the local tailors in all the villages and towns had a good going business. But soon along came John Collier, 40-shilling tailors, Burtons and so on, and it was off the peg suits thereafter. Actually, the middleman tweed merchant's business was doomed when father took over the business, but that was not really known to him at the time. However, Incidentally, he had a little sort of secondary business called Mullen and Weatherstone, which was based in Hawick, and there was there manufactured down a Venel off Hawick High Street in a lean-to brick-built shed with a tin roof, 2 hand looms, hand knitting machines, zzz, 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 making scarves. And these scarves were then subjected to brushing with a big machine loaded up with teasels, which raised a pile on the scarf. And these scarves were manufactured in Hawick, put into a wicker hamper and onto the train in Hawick, across the station platform in Galashiels and up by train to the East Station in Peebles, which of course was just 200 yards from the business premises in Peebles, from where the scarves were dispatched. He began to emphasise that part of the business, and he sold gross after gross of scarves. And as a one-man business, he toured the country, visiting various drapers all over the country and taking his orders personally, and then coming back to Peebles to assemble the orders and dispatch them from 16 to 18 Dean Park. However, we were living, as I said, in Inzivar 23 Kirkland Street, very near the golf course, and the golf professional, Mr. Henderson, had 2 boys, Matthew and Robert, about the same age as me, and we as boys were more or less given free access to the golf course, which meant that I should have become good at golf, but I developed a bit of a slice, which Peebles Golf Course actually will excuse you with, because many of the fairways slope down from right to left, and if you hit the ball a bit right, it corrects the trajectory, and you end up hopefully in the middle of the fairway. But I didn't ever get very good at golf. I did enjoy cycling, but I was no good at any other form of sport. Jack Allen was the gym teacher, physical education teacher at Peebles High School at the time. He had been trained as a Spitfire pilot, but was just finishing his training when the war ended, and he was not required. So he went into teacher training and came to be the PT teacher at the high school. I got on well with Jack Allen, but only because I was engaged to photograph the sports teams, and that was a hobby that I had taken up using my father's old bellows camera, and I became very keen in photography and blacked out the window of my bedroom and converted it therefore into a photographic darkroom, so that throughout my school career in the 50s I was doing good business with the medical hall as a supplier of film and developing chemicals developer and fixer, and supplies of bromide paper. George Pennell actually built a photographic enlarger which I acquired, and I produced black and white photographs, many of which I still have. Photography has developed since then, of course, through 35mm rangefinder camera into a SLR 35mm camera, and more recently, of course, now I'm using a compact digital camera. Back to the 50s. Well, that's some of the school life. I I was able to use the astronomical observatory in Peebles High School, which is still there, and I do remember looking at the moons on Jupiter and all the details in our own moon in evenings when I was permitted to go up there and use the place. But one night I was very foolish and left the trap door open, which gave access to the sky, but unfortunately it gave access to the rain down onto the telescope, and thereafter, of course, needless to say, I was banned from using the observatory at the school. I was never very keen on the Scouts. I think I was in the Peebles Scouts for about 5 minutes, because although my friends are all Scouts, I didn't like I didn't like rough games. I really don't like contact sports at all. And the Scout meetings seemed to consist of playing British Bulldogs in the Eastgate Hall, now the Eastgate Theatre, on what was a floor full of skelfs and rough floors. That was no fun for me. But I became very friendly with all the boys that were in the Scouts, and we were able to obtain and use the Scout tents to go and camp in Arran. Again, my father's wicker hamper that transported scarves from Hoyk to Peebles and went back empty was pressed into service with all the gear that we would need for camping in Arran. And the boys themselves, 6 of us, cycled from Peebles to Ardrossan. It's about 80 miles, travelling light, of course, and got to Ardrossan to pick up the wicker hamper from the goods yard, the railway goods yard, only to discover it was, although the steamer hadn't left for Brodick, the goods yard was closed, and we couldn't get access to our hamper with all our gear, tents, cooking materials. So nevertheless, we went across to Arran and went to the farm where we had arranged to camp, and we were permitted to sleep in the barn for the night, which was pretty uncomfortable and cold, but that was all right. And then Harvey Robertson had an uncle in Saltcoats. He stayed behind in Ardrossan, acquired the hamper the following morning, and came over, and we got all our gear. I think it was the first of 3 camps we had in Arran, from courtesy of the equipment from Peebles Scouts. Clubs and societies. I was never much of a speaker in public. I couldn't take part in debates, which were encouraged by Philip Hutton. When I say Philip Hutton, that's the father of the present Philip Hutton. Philip Hutton was the English teacher at Peebles High School in the early 50s. A wonderful teacher, but he departed to Daniel Stewart's College in Edinburgh. That was okay. Geography teacher, I remember Mr. Salmond, who set up a trip to Switzerland in, I think, 1956, and the members of that party got on a train in Peebles, down to Galashiels, onto the night train to St Pancras, breakfast in St Pancras, another train to Dover, across the channel in a boat, and then another night train across the continent, and we woke up in Interlaken. So that was a marvellous trip to the Bernese Oberland, run in the 1950s by Mr. Salmon, the geography teacher. The teachers were all good sports, and they took part more than once in a hockey game between the teachers and the senior pupils. There was a bit of dressing up and fun and games involved, but I wasn't taking part. I was the photographer, and I still have photographs of the good sports, the teachers who did that. At the very end of term and at the end of school days, we did have a party in the dining hall where I think we'd managed to smuggle in some cider, but that was as far as anything slightly risque was involved.
You mentioned about
Yes.
trains
Yes.
in the old Calais. That would be interesting to hear about that.
I don't know when the branch line from Symington to Peebles closed, but I think it was 52, maybe 51. When we were first in Peebles, I was able to go down to the Calais station to meet the lunchtime train, and was permitted easily, with no persuasion, to get up onto the footplate and go forward from the front of the train, and then reversed on the loop line back along towards Symington backwards, then forwards onto the railway turntable, which was not motorised, of course, and it was critical to balance the locomotive on the turntable so that it would easily be moved. And I assisted the driver and fireman to actually rotate the engine through 180 degrees, therefore pointing it up towards Symington and then back and onto the front of the carriages ready to go back. Great fun. And I did walk through the railway tunnel when there were still trains running, but of course chose my time pretty carefully. If you've been in the railway tunnel, you'll know there's a bolt hole halfway along. Yes. Okay.
Did you use the trains much when you lived in Peebles?
Well, I only travelled on the Stobo on the Symington to Peebles train once, but Father, when he was first in business in 1949, he could leave Glasgow Central Station at 7 o'clock on a Monday morning and be in his office in Peebles at 10 to 9 in the morning, using the train to Symington and then to Peebles. He boarded, as it were, because he was commuting by the week before the family actually moved in 1950. He was commuting and lived in the house called Rothes, which was run as a boarding house by people called Murray, who I think were among them were posties. Mm-hmm. But I was able to see the coming of the diesel rail cars to the Edinburgh line, and travelled on the diesel rail cars more than once. In the early 50s, which were eventually superseded by nothing, sadly.
So later, when you finished school, how old were you then?
Well, I was 16. I was 17 when I finished school. Mm-hmm. Yes, the cinema was part of our life at that time, particularly the Playhouse, but also the Empire Cinema in the Brigade. We used to go as boys to see the serials, the exciting serials, I suppose, equivalent to Dick Barton, I'm not sure, in the Empire Cinema. And one of the funnies that came on regularly were little features by the Three Stooges. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they were popular comedy trio, and one of them was called Mo. And this guy, Matthew Henderson, the son of the golf professional, he thought that I looked like Mo. and he dubbed me Mo, so that became my nickname. And if you ask around Peebles, you'll still discover that people knew who Mo Baird was. That was the Empire Cinema. But a film that impressed me greatly was Scott of the Antarctic, and although I've seen it again in the Eastgate Theatre in recent years, it didn't have the same influence on me. But I certainly have since been able to go to the Antarctic, mainly and partly based upon my experience of the Playhouse Cinema. If I wasn't interested in sport, I did become interested in aeromodelling. And it was Mr. Barry, the commercial teacher at the high school, that ran a little club there at school. And I built aeroplanes, mostly scale models of jet aircraft, but very few of them that I built were actually able to fly. I'm sorry to say, or if they did fly, the first flight would usually end in complete disaster. But I got sufficiently interested to get a little tiny diesel 1.5cc engine for airplanes, and I could run it on a test bed in our shed in the back garden. But it never succeeded in powering a proper flight. Mm-hmm. That was that. Photography really overtook aeromodelling as my main hobby. That was the story. Holidays were all down the Clyde in a place called Millport on the Isle of Cumbrae, where I learned to row a little rowing boat out to do fishing in the bay. It was a very different story when I went to university in '56, because I thought, well, I've done a bit of rowing. I think I'll join the boat club, and so I did. And although not very sporty, I did get a seat in a boat on the Union Canal at Edinburgh University Boat Club. The place where Catherine Granger, of course, cut her teeth in the sport of rowing, and that was my involvement with sport at university. In the late 50s, I used to come home to Peebles on vacations and would get a job in the Tweeddale garage with Jimmy Hopkirk. And he got me into overalls and let me do jobs such as decarbonising engines and one occasion actually reboring an engine, things that are never done nowadays. But I learned so much about mechanics in cars that I realised that had I not been studying medicine, I would have been keen on engineering. Jimmy Hopkirk taught me a lot of stuff about the maintenance of motor cars, and I was forever grateful to him. But one of his apprentices in the late 50s was a guy called Mackenzie from Cayley, was finishing his apprenticeship, and he had used a 1934 Austin 7 to commute from Cayley to Peebles to his work every day. And I knew that he maintained this car wonderfully. I mean, he would do something to the car every day, either check the tyre pressures, check the points gap, check the contact breaker gap, clean out the brake drums. He did maintain the car wonderfully well, but at the end of his apprenticeship, of course, he had to go and do national service. He was going to the army, so he wanted rid of his car. And in 1958, he sold me that car for £17 and 10 shillings. And that became my car, and I became significantly less fit because formerly I'd cycled everywhere, but now I had motor transport. I joined the motor club in Edinburgh University and rose to be the president of that in due time, despite the fact I didn't have a really very fancy car, but it did me well. In fact, it did me so well that I became rather too involved with the motor club and the boat club at university, to the detriment of my studies. And it's fortunate that I didn't chase women at all at university, because otherwise, if I'd had that or drinking and smoking on top of it, or playing bridge, I would never have qualified. As it was, I just scraped through the medical course, but had a rounded life and great time at university from 56 to 62. Meantime, at home, my father's health was suffering. He was trying to run a one-man business, and it wasn't doing well, because in the 50s, in the early 50s, you weren't dressed going out in the winter unless you wore a scarf. But that fashion diminished, and the sales of scarves fell away. So his tweed merchant's business had folded, and now his scarf manufacture and sales business was not doing well. So it emphasised to me that I was better going for a profession than trying to dabble in business, because through no fault of his own, really, his business didn't do well. And it was from that point that we sold the house in Kirkland Street and moved into the flat above the business in 1618 Dean Park. So I'm forever grateful to my father for having the good fortune to bring the family to Peebles in 1950, because 50s were a wonderful time for me, and maybe I've given you some flavour of that. But father's health wasn't special, and the business was actually formally put into voluntary liquidation at the end of the day. But in order to put me through university, Mother had gone back to teaching, and she taught remedial, as they called it, in Kingsland Primary, to supplement the family income towards the end of the 50s, when Father's business wasn't doing so well. So that's the story. Although his business didn't do well, it was nevertheless a good move to bring the family to Peebles. I'm quite certain of that. Anything else? I got to university with only 3 hires, which sounds impossible nowadays. But one hire was physics and chemistry, so there were 2 subjects there. The other was geography, and the other was English. I think I got into university to some extent, or to a great extent, on the basis of the interview. And I still think that they should interview applicants for medicine and veterinary and dentistry, and not rely entirely on academic performance, because the academic achievers are not necessarily going to make good doctors. I don't know. I'm suggesting that my rounded background was a good basis for becoming a GP, but there you go. Mm-hmm. That's for other people to judge.
So how typical was your choice of study and career?
Based on the fact that my mother had 3 brothers who were doctors, and my father had a brother a doctor and a brother who was a vet. And so it was, in a sense, in the family, mm-hmm. although neither of my parents were medical. And the choice of a profession over going into business was, I explained to you, because of the business can make you very rich or not.
So did you have any brothers and sisters, or?
Yes, one sister who has moved back to Peebles now. She's moved into McCarthy and Stone.
Oh, right.
She was a teacher in East Kilbride for most of her career.
Amongst your friends and peers, what sort of ambition did they have?
They all seemed to do well, to be truthful. Harvey Robertson became a vet. He's moved back to Peebles. Bill Goodburn was the son of Robbie Goodburn of Blackwood and Smith. Bill Goodburn, known as William, became a partner in Blackwood and Smith as well. And then there was Donald Miller, who became a chemistry teacher. Ronald Russell, who I think he became an architect. The girls, don't know. But they were all. I think I was fortunate. I had a year where there were fairly bright sparks among the classmates.